The Old Man at the Gate. The afternoon light in Charleston in October is a particular shade of gold, the kind that makes everything look more dignified than it actually is. It pours through the Spanish moss and the wrought iron gates and settles on the sidewalk like something that was placed there deliberately by someone with good taste. Edward Hargrove had always loved that light. He'd built Hargrove Palace to face west precisely because of it. He was standing in that light now, leaning on a cane he didn't need, wearing dark glasses he'd bought at a drugstore on King Street, and feeling profoundly foolish. This, he thought, is what 74 years of living gets you. Standing outside your own front door, pretending you can't see it. The cane was black, collapsible aluminium, the kind sold in pharmacies between the blood pressure monitors and the compression socks. It was the cheapest thing Edward Hargrove had touched in 2 decades, and he was gripping it hard enough that his knuckles had gone pale. He'd taken a car service 3 blocks from the hotel, walked back on foot, slowly, haltingly, one hand trailing the brick facade of the neighbouring building, and positioned himself beside the lamppost at the corner of Meeting Street and Hazel, roughly 40 feet from the brass-plated entrance of his own property. The doorman, Marcus Tully, hadn't recognised him. That had been the first surprise. The second surprise was how quickly people stopped seeing him at all. He'd been standing there for 19 minutes. He knew because he could hear the clock tower of St. Philip's Church marking the quarter hour, and he'd counted the minutes in between by force of habit. Edward Hargrove had never in his adult life not known what time it was. A man who doesn't know what time it is, his father used to say, is a man who doesn't know where he stands. His father had said this while wearing a watch that cost less than the belt around Edward's waist right now. 19 minutes, 40, perhaps 50 people had passed. A group of college students, 2 women with strollers, a man in a seersucker suit who glanced at Edward briefly and then away, the way people look at things they have already decided are not their problem. A hotel guest, Edward recognised the shopping bag from the boutique in the lobby, who walked within arm's reach without breaking stride. Not one person stopped. Edward was not surprised. He had expected this. He had, in fact, been counting on it. The data point of human indifference was the whole point of the exercise. He needed to see it plainly, stripped of the courtesies that surrounded him every moment of every day inside that building, where everyone knew who he was and everyone was paid to be kind to him. He needed to see what the world looked like when nobody knew his name. What he had not expected was how much it would bother him. You've known this for years, he told himself. This isn't new information, but knowing a thing and standing in the middle of it, invisible in your own city, in the gold October light outside your own hotel, those were different experiences entirely. He shifted his weight on the cane. His hip was beginning to complain. Real blindness, he supposed, came with other indignities too. The loss of equilibrium, the constant uncertainty of terrain. He'd done some reading on it before today. He'd read about a lot of things in the last 6 months, since the cardiologist had delivered his verdict in the measured, apologetic tone that doctors reserve for news they would rather not give. Mr. Hargrove, your heart has been compensating for a long time. It can't compensate forever. Edward had listened, thanked the man, tipped the parking attendant on the way out, and driven home to think. He had been thinking for 6 months. The boy appeared at 4:47 in the afternoon. Edward noticed him the way you notice something that has been in your peripheral vision for a while before you consciously register it. A gradual resolving of background into foreground. The boy was sitting on an overturned milk crate on the opposite sidewalk, a wooden kit box at his feet, a rag tucked into his back pocket. He was small for what Edward guessed was 10 or 11, slight-shouldered, with a serious face, and the concentrated stillness of someone who has learned that stillness costs nothing and fidgeting costs time. He was polishing a pair of men's Oxfords, both hands working in unhurried circles, and he was watching the street with the particular alertness of a child who spends a lot of time in public spaces and has learned to read them. He was, Edward realized, watching him. Not with the pitying, head-tilted look that some people gave to the visibly impaired. Not with the nervous, guilt-adjacent gaze of someone calculating the cost of stopping. The boy was watching Edward the way a careful person watches something that doesn't quite add up, with mild, intelligent suspicion and something that might have been concern. Edward looked away, adjusted his dark glasses, gripped his cane. Across the street, he heard the milk crates scrape against the sidewalk. He didn't look up. He kept his gaze fixed on the middle distance, the studied, unfocused stare he'd been practicing in the mirror for a week. He heard sneakers on concrete, the particular sound of someone crossing a street quickly but without running. And then there was a shadow falling across the patch of sidewalk in front of him, and a voice said, "Sir, are you okay?" The voice was young and unadorned, no performance of concern, no social script being followed. Just a direct question asked by someone who wanted a direct answer. Edward turned his head in the approximate direction of the voice. "I'm fine, son," he said. He practiced this too, a slight slackening of the gaze, the head tilted 2 degrees too far to the right. Just resting. A pause, then, "You've been standing there for a while." "Have I?" "Since before I finished those shoes." Another pause. "You need to sit down?" "I don't need to," Edward began, and then something in the boy's voice, not impatience, not pity, but a kind of steady, matter-of-fact insistence that this situation required attention, made him stop. He let out a breath. "Perhaps," he said, "if there's somewhere nearby." "There's a bench," the boy said. 2 doors down, by the hotel entrance. "Come on." He didn't take Edward's arm immediately. He moved to Edward's left side and said, "I'm going to be on your left, okay? Just let me know if I'm going too fast." And then waited for Edward to nod before he matched his pace. They walked slowly. The boy said, "Curb," before each change in pavement elevation. He didn't chatter. He didn't fill the silence with reassurances or observations. He simply walked and guided and paid attention. At the bench, wrought iron, painted black, positioned between a magnolia tree and the entrance to Hargrove Palace, the boy said, "Step down, then step in." And Edward lowered himself onto the bench with the careful dignity of a man whose body has begun to have opinions about furniture. "Thank you," Edward said. "You want me to call someone?" the boy asked. He was standing in front of Edward now. Edward kept his gaze slightly off, aimed at the boy's left shoulder rather than his face. No, I'll be all right in a moment. I just need..." He made a small, dismissive gesture. "My phone," he said. "I can't always... My sight isn't good in this light." A pause. He prepared this part. "I was trying to call a car, to get home." The boy considered this. "Can I help? I can make the call for you." "That's kind, but I don't want to take up your time." "I'm not busy right now," the boy said, simply. It was true. He'd left his kit box on the other sidewalk, unattended, to come across here. It was an entirely undefended statement, with no performance of sacrifice attached to it. Edward reached into his jacket pocket, slowly, with the careful deliberation of a man navigating by touch, and produced his phone. It was a phone he'd borrowed from his housekeeper for the occasion. His own was too obviously expensive. The boy took it, turned it over in his hands. "What's the number?" Edward recited a number, his driver's cell, and the boy dialed. While it rang, Edward became aware that the boy's eyes had travelled to his other jacket pocket, the pocket where the wallet was. It was visible, barely, the edge of brown leather, a wallet thick enough to suggest its contents. Edward had put it there deliberately. This was the second layer of the test, the one he hadn't written down for anyone, the one he'd constructed privately in the sleepless hours of early morning. Not just whether anyone would stop, but whether, once stopped, the person would behave. The wallet was accessible. The old man was blind. The equation was not complicated. The boy looked at the wallet. Then he looked away. Then, and this was the part Edward had not anticipated, the part that would keep him awake that night, and the night after, and many nights to come. The boy's right hand moved toward the jacket pocket. Slowly. Then it stopped. Edward, watching through the carefully unfocused veil of his performance, watched the boy's face. He saw it all. The knowledge, the awareness of the wallet's location, its accessibility, the calculation, not a moral one yet, just the raw arithmetic of possibility. Then something else moving across that young face, something slower and quieter than calculation, something that lived below the level of decision-making, in the place where character actually resides. The hand moved away, not with drama, not with the visible effort of someone fighting temptation, with a kind of quiet, almost unconscious certainty. The way you move your hand away from something that was never really yours to begin with. The boy spoke into the phone. "Hello? Yes, sir, I'm calling on behalf of someone. He's at Hargrove Palace Hotel on Meeting Street. He needs a car. Can you come?" A pause. "Yes, sir, okay." He ended the call and held the phone back out to Edward. "He'll be here in 10 minutes. "Thank you," Edward said. He took the phone. His hand, he was almost certain, was trembling. "You can wait here," the boy said. "I'll stay till the car comes." "That's not necessary." "I know," the boy said. "I'll stay anyway." They sat in silence, the boy standing, Edward seated, for a while. The gold light was beginning to amber at the edges. Across the street, a woman was examining the boy's unattended kit box with mild curiosity and moving on. From inside the hotel came the low murmur of the lobby, the distant sound of a piano in the bar, the particular acoustics of a place designed to make money feel quiet. After perhaps 4 minutes, the boy reached into his own jeans pocket. He produced a folded bill. He held it out toward Edward's hand specifically, the hand resting on the bench beside his knee, because a blind man's hand is easier to find than his face. "Here," the boy said, "for the cab, in case there's a charge." Edward looked at the bill. It was a $5 bill, folded once. He could see, even through the performance of not quite seeing, that it was the only bill in the boy's hand. He could see the slight roughness of the paper from handling, a bill that had been earned and carried and perhaps counted a few times before ending up here. "I can't take your money, son," Edward said. His voice came out different than he intended, lower, scraped. "You don't know if you need it yet," the boy said. "And I don't need it right now." He pressed it gently against Edward's palm, and when Edward's fingers closed around it, not quite voluntarily, the way your hand closes around something simply because a hand that's given something tends to close, the boy said, very quietly, "For the cab home, sir, in case nobody else stops." In case nobody else stops. Edward sat on the bench outside his own hotel, holding a folded $5 bill, and could not speak. He was 74 years old. He had shaken hands with senators and signed contracts worth more than some countries' annual budgets. He had been praised and feted and courted. He had also been abandoned, betrayed, and left alone in ways that had hollowed him out at the center and filled the hollow with a cold, efficient skepticism that had served him well for 2 decades. Not one thing in those 2 decades had made him feel the way this $5 bill felt in his hand. The car came. Edward thanked the boy. The boy said, "Take care of yourself," and went back across the street to his milk crate and his kit box and his afternoon. In the back of the car, Edward Hargrove took off the dark glasses. He held them in his left hand and the $5 bill in his right. He looked at the bill for a long time. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in his breast pocket. Not the one with the wallet, but the one closest to his chest. He had a great deal to think about. "I've been testing people for 20 years, he thought, as the car turned off Meeting Street. "I've been running tests and reading results and making judgments, and I never once considered that the test might be running in both directions." He closed his eyes. Outside, Charleston moved past the windows, the steeples, the palmetto trees, the old buildings wearing their age the way certain people do, with the composure of things that have survived more than they look like they have. He didn't see it. He was already somewhere else, already replaying the scene on the bench, already working backward through the afternoon toward a conclusion he could feel but hadn't yet put into words. The $5 was still warm from the boy's pocket, in case nobody else stops. He was 74 years old, and a child had just said the truest thing anyone had said to him in 20 years. The boy, who didn't know he was being watched. There is a particular quality of attention that money buys. Not the thing itself, but the infrastructure of it. The cameras, the feeds, the quiet architecture of surveillance that accumulates around wealth, the way sediment accumulates around a stone at the bottom of a river, slowly, invisibly, until the stone is so covered you've almost forgotten what it looks like underneath. Edward Hargrove had cameras everywhere. Not because he was paranoid, or not only because he was paranoid, but because he was meticulous. His father had run a hardware store in Macon, Georgia, and had kept a leather-bound ledger in which he recorded everything. Every transaction, every customer complaint, every instance where a supplier had shorted him a box of nails. If you don't track it, you can't understand it, his father had said. And if you don't understand it, you can't improve it. Edward had taken this principle and expanded it across an empire of 43 hotels in 21 states, and somewhere in that expansion, he had stopped tracking merchandise and started tracking people. He wasn't proud of this. He'd never told anyone about it either. The footage from the exterior cameras of Hargrove Palace, the sidewalk, the entrance, the 40-foot radius around the front gate, was archived automatically and stored for 90 days before being overwritten. Edward had begun reviewing it sporadically about 8 months ago. Not systematically, not with any fixed intention. He'd pulled up the lobby feed one night during a bout of insomnia, watched the 2 a.m. emptiness of the marble floors, and found it strangely calming. Then he'd started watching the exterior. And that was when he'd first seen the boy. It had been a Tuesday in February, bitter cold for Charleston. The kind of damp cold that gets into your joints before you've registered that you're cold at all. The boy had been sitting on the milk crate at the corner opposite. The milk crate was apparently a permanent fixture, dragged out each afternoon and taken back wherever he lived each evening, with his wooden kit box and a pair of gloves that were too thin for the weather. Edward had watched him for perhaps 15 minutes before anything happened. Then a man had walked past and dropped his wallet. Not a dramatic drop. The wallet had slipped from an outer coat pocket, the kind of thing that happens in cold weather when hands are in pockets and the friction that keeps things where they should be is reduced. The man hadn't noticed. He kept walking. The boy had noticed. He'd stood up from the milk crate immediately, picked up the wallet, called out. Edward couldn't hear the words through the camera, but the body language was clear. The raised hand, the shout, the universal grammar of, "Hey, you dropped something." The man hadn't heard, already too far. The boy had looked at the wallet in his hand, looked at the man's retreating back, and then, without apparent deliberation, broken into a run. He'd caught up to the man half a block down, returned the wallet. The man had looked surprised, checked the wallet's contents with the slightly embarrassed suspicion of someone who isn't sure whether to be grateful or suspicious, and then apparently been satisfied, because he'd given the boy something, Edward couldn't see what, and walked on. The boy had walked back to the milk crate, sat down, and resumed polishing the shoes on his stand, as if nothing had happened. Edward had watched this footage 3 times. Then he'd pulled the archive for the previous 90 days. He found 17 instances, not all wallets. A handbag left on the bench by a woman who walked half a block before she remembered it. A paper bag of groceries set down while someone made a phone call and forgot 'em. A child's stuffed rabbit, dropped and not noticed, which the boy had picked up and, Edward had to watch this part twice to be sure, carried to the hotel entrance and handed to the doorman with what appeared to be a brief explanation, presumably so that the doorman could reunite it with its owner. A stuffed rabbit, left with the doorman so that it could be found. Edward had sat with this information for a long time. The boy's name, it turned out, was not difficult to learn. Edward employed 112 people at Hargrove Palace. The woman who mopped the third-floor corridors and cleaned the rooms at the end of the hall was named Diana Webb. She'd been with the hotel for 9 years. She was, according to her file, a widow. Her husband had died of a stroke when she was 31, with 2 children, a daughter named Kezia, 7, and a son named Marcus, 11. Marcus Webb attended Robert Small's elementary school, 3 blocks away, and apparently spent his afternoons on that milk crate across the street from his mother's place of work. Edward didn't speak to the boy. He watched him for 6 months through the cameras before the afternoon of the fake blindness, and in those 6 months, he identified 17 more instances of the same basic pattern, an opportunity to take or to look away, followed by Marcus Webb choosing neither. What he also identified, and this was the thing that lived with him differently, that he didn't write down even in the private notebook he kept in the drawer of his bedside table, was one afternoon in March when it had almost gone differently. It had been a warm day, the first properly warm day of that spring, and a tourist had left a camera bag unattended on the bench outside the hotel entrance while he went back inside to retrieve something he'd forgotten. The camera bag was expensive, Canon logo, padded, the kind of bag that exists to contain things worth protecting. The tourist had been inside for nearly 4 minutes. The sidewalk had been briefly empty. Marcus Webb had looked at that bag for a long time. Edward had watched him look at it, had watched him stand up from the milk crate, walk closer, not to the bag, but to the front edge of the sidewalk, as if he was just stretching his legs. Stand there, look at the bag, look at the hotel entrance, look at the bag again. 4 minutes is a long time when you are 11 years old, and the world has not been especially generous to you. The tourist had come back out. Marcus had already turned away. He'd gone back to his milk crate and sat down and didn't look at the tourist or the bag again. Edward had watched that footage too, more than once, because here was the thing that a 17-instance sample of good behavior did not tell you, and that the footage in March did. The boy was not a saint. He was a child. He felt what any child would feel. The difference was not that the wanting wasn't there. It was that something else was there too. Something that had been built or grown or taught or simply arrived in him by whatever combination of nature and necessity makes a person's character. And that something was stronger than the wanting. Edward respected this more than he would have respected a boy who simply never felt the pull. Virtue that has never been tested is not virtue. It's just luck. What he'd seen in Marcus Webb was something much harder. Virtue that had sat with the wanting and chosen otherwise. He thought about that in February, when his son Preston flew in from Atlanta. Preston Hargrove was 49 years old, silver-haired, expensively maintained, and possessed of the particular charm of a man who has spent his entire life in the company of people who needed something from his father. He'd grown up in money, lost it with Edward, when Edward was 55, and the overextension of the early 2000s had brought 3 of Edward's original hotels down, and then, when Edward had rebuilt, more carefully, more slowly, over the following decade, had returned with the ease of a man who has decided that his absence during a difficult period requires no acknowledgement. Edward had never said anything about those 3 years. He'd noticed, though. "Dad," Preston said, over dinner at the hotel restaurant, "you really need to let me take some of the operational load. The board is nervous. You had that health scare in December. The December episode had been a particularly unpleasant 40 minutes in the cardiology ward, the precursor to the more significant conversation that had followed. And they need to see that there's a transition plan." "There is a transition plan," Edward said. "Then let me see it." When it's time, Preston cut a piece of his steak with the practiced calm of someone who has learned that arguing with his father directly is a losing proposition, and has shifted to the strategy of surrounding the argument instead. "The staff here are getting attached to you in ways that aren't professional," he said. "That woman on the 3rd floor, Diana something, she's been staying past her shift to check on you. That's not appropriate." "Diana Webb is an exceptional employee," Edward said. "I'm sure she is. I'm just saying, you're too accessible. People take advantage." Edward looked at his son across the candlelit table. He thought about a stuffed rabbit, carried to a doorman so that it could be found. "People take advantage," he said, "when they're given something worth taking advantage of." Preston smiled the smile of a man who assumes he's being agreed with. "Exactly. That's why you need—" "I wasn't agreeing with you, Preston." The smile stayed, but something behind it recalculated. "I was making a different point," Edward said. He picked up his wineglass. "Finish your steak." That night, alone in his apartment on the top floor of the hotel, Edward sat at the writing desk by the window, the one that faced west toward the harbour, so that he could see the lights on the water, and opened the bottom drawer. Inside was a small notebook, green, the kind with a ribbon bookmark and an envelope unsealed. He'd been adding to both intermittently for 3 months. He took out the notebook and read what he'd written in the margins of his most recent entry. The question is not whether he would take the wallet. The question is whether he would give something, without being asked, to someone who appears to have less than him. That's the harder test. Not whether you resist taking, whether you give. He closed the notebook. He looked out at the harbour. Then he picked up his pen and began to write something new. Something that went not in the notebook, but in the envelope. Something he would not finish for another 4 months. Something he started now because certain sentences need to be begun before they can be completed. And the sentence he was beginning started with "Dear Marcus." Downstairs, in the 3rd floor corridor, Diana Webb was mopping the same section of floor she'd mopped 1,000 times. In the lobby, the night shift doorman was exchanging pleasantries with a couple returning from dinner. Across the city, Marcus Webb was presumably doing homework, or sleeping, or lying awake the way children sometimes do, with the weight of things they haven't yet learned to name. He had no idea. He had no idea that someone, in a building he could see from his milk crate, had been watching him the way you watch something rare. Not to capture it, not to own it, but to understand it, to learn from it, to remember that it exists. Edward sealed the envelope and placed it back in the drawer. He did not yet know all the things it would eventually contain. That was all right. He had time. The cardiologist had said he had time. He believed this, mostly. Mostly was enough to write by. 3 blocks away, the clock tower of St. Philip's marked 9 o'clock. Preston called his own lawyer the next morning. Edward didn't know this yet. He would learn it later from a contact in the legal community who knew both men, in the oblique, face-saving way that information travels in a city as small as Charleston's upper social tier. The call lasted 45 minutes. The subject was the existing will. The existing will, as it stood, left the bulk of Edward's assets to Preston with a series of charitable bequests. It had been written 4 years ago, when Edward had still believed that blood was thicker than everything, that the forgiveness he had chosen, silently, without naming it, during Preston's return was enough to rebuild the architecture of trust between them. He had begun to doubt this in December, when he was lying in the hospital bed, and Preston had arrived 3 hours after being called, slightly flushed, with the particular energy of a man who had needed to finish something before he could come. He had not said anything then, either. He was, his late wife Margaret had once told him, pathologically conflict-averse for someone who wins every argument he enters. She'd been right. She'd been right about most things. She died of pancreatic cancer 11 years ago, in this city, in a hospice 3 miles from this hotel. And Edward had sat beside her for 17 days and had not left once except to shower and change. And when she was gone, he had come back to this building and climbed the stairs to the apartment and stood at this window for a very long time. Preston had sent flowers. They had been expensive flowers. Edward had put them in a vase and looked at them and thought about the difference between the gesture and the thing the gesture is supposed to represent, and how far those two things can drift from each other while still being performed by the same person. He thought about this now at his writing desk, with the envelope in the drawer and the harbour lights on the water. He thought about Marcus Webb, on his milk crate, giving $5 he didn't have to a stranger he had no reason to help. He thought about what his father had said about ledgers. If you don't track it, you can't understand it. And if you don't understand it, you can't improve it. Edward opened the drawer. He added 3 more sentences to the letter, then he closed the drawer, turned off the desk lamp, and went to bed. What the safe holds. Spring came to Charleston the way it always does. Not gradually, but all at once, as if the city simply woke up one morning and decided it was done with winter. The azaleas on the Battery went from bare to blazing in what felt like a weekend. The tourists came back. The sidewalks filled. Marcus Webb adjusted his schedule accordingly. In winter, the after-school foot traffic on Meeting Street was thin. People walked quickly, head down, no one lingering near a shoeshine stand. But by April, the pace slowed. Visitors strolled. Shoes that had survived a winter of salt and rain presented themselves for restoration. On a Good Friday in April, Marcus could earn $12, sometimes $15 in tips, plus whatever the shine itself cost. He'd set his own prices, $2 for a basic buff, $4 for a full conditioning, and he'd learned to read customers well enough to know who would negotiate and who wouldn't. He told his mother about the old man, not everything. He hadn't told her about the $5. That felt like something private, not secret exactly, but personal in a way that made him reluctant to put it into words. He told her that he'd helped an elderly gentleman who seemed disoriented, that he'd waited with him until a car came, that the man had seemed grateful. Diana Webb had listened to this with the expression she wore when Marcus did something that made her feel 2 contradictory things at once, relief and something that looked almost like worry. "You're a good boy," she'd said, and the way she said it contained a warning, not of the "don't be too good, the world will take advantage" variety, but the quieter kind, the kind that says, "I see who you are and I'm trying to protect it." He understood. He'd always understood his mother in the way that children who've spent a lot of time watching their parents do, reading the text and subtext simultaneously. Diana Webb was 41 years old and had mopped more square footage of hotel hallway than she could calculate. She did not complain about this. She was not, by temperament, a complainer. She was a problem solver, which is a different thing. And the particular problem she was currently solving was how to raise 2 children on a single income in a city whose cost of living was rising faster than her wages. She solved this the way she solved most problems, with precision, with consistency, and with a kind of focused dignity that Marcus had absorbed by proximity. He thought about her on the morning of the phone call. It came in mid-April, on a Wednesday, while Marcus was at school. The call went to Diana's cell phone, which she kept in her apron pocket on her shifts. The caller identified himself as Mr. Hargrove's personal assistant, a man named Gerald, and the message was brief and strange. Mr. Hargrove would like to offer Marcus the opportunity to spend 3 afternoons a week in the hotel, learning from the food and beverage staff, beginning the following Monday, if Diana consented and Marcus was interested. There would be a small stipend, $30 a week, for his time. This was in addition to Diana's normal employment and was not contingent on it. Diana stood in the 3rd-floor corridor with her mop in one hand and her phone in the other, and stared at the wall for a long moment. Then she called Marcus's school and left a message asking him to come directly to the hotel after his last class. The hotel was a different place from the inside. Marcus had been in the lobby before. He'd waited for his mother in the lobby occasionally, in a chair by the window, keeping very still the way his mother had asked him to keep still because, "We are guests here, Marcus, even if it's my workplace." But the lobby was public. The lobby was where the hotel faced the outside world. The rest of the building was something else entirely. Gerald, a thin man in a charcoal jacket who spoke in short, complete sentences and seemed to regard all questions as reasonable until proven otherwise, walked Marcus through the service corridors, past the linen room and the kitchen delivery entrance and the staff locker area, and explained the structure of the food and beverage department with the same thoroughness he apparently brought to everything. "You'll work with Carl Whitmore in the afternoon bar," Gerald said. "You won't be handling any alcohol. You'll learn about inventory management, about setting up for service, about the mechanics of how a bar operates. Mr. Hargrove feels that practical knowledge of how hospitality works from the inside is valuable for someone who is..." He paused, in the way of someone who has been given information and is deciding how much of it to relay. Curious about how things work, Marcus considered this. "Does Mr. Hargrove know who I am?" "He does," Gerald said. "Does he know I shine shoes across the street?" "He does," Gerald said again, with the same intonation, which told Marcus nothing about whether this was a good thing or a bad thing. "Why?" Marcus asked. This was, he felt, the correct question. Gerald looked at him with an expression that Marcus couldn't quite classify, somewhere between approval and amusement. "That," Gerald said, "is a question I'd encourage you to hold on to. You may get an answer eventually." He didn't get an answer that week, or the week after. Carl Whitmore was 53, built like someone who had once played college football and had not entirely stopped, and possessed of the methodical precision of a man who had spent 30 years building cocktails the way some men build furniture. With care, with an eye for proportion, and with the philosophy that the details are where quality actually lives. He treated Marcus's presence in his bar the way he apparently treated everything, as a fact to be worked with rather than questioned. "You want to learn something?" Carl said on the first afternoon, setting a row of highball glasses on the bar in front of Marcus. "Watch this." He polished a glass, not quickly, slowly with a folded white cloth, holding the glass up to the light after each pass to check for smears. Then he set it down and polished another. "Every glass," Carl said. "Not the ones people will see, all of them. Because once you start making exceptions based on what people can see, you've changed your standard. And once your standard changes, everything changes." He set down the second glass. "Your mum know her way around a clean corridor?" "Yes," Marcus said. "I know," Carl said. "I've worked with Diana for 9 years. You can tell a lot about how someone was raised by how they treat the parts of the work nobody's looking at." Marcus filed this away. He filed most things away. The weeks had a rhythm. School, the hotel 3 afternoons a week. The milk crate on the other 2 afternoons and on Saturdays. The stipend was real, $30 each week, in an envelope left at the front desk addressed to Master Marcus Webb, which Marcus found both formal and slightly embarrassing. He gave $10 of it to his mother each week, told her it was for groceries, and watched her not argue about it with the specific non-argumentation of a person who has decided that some gifts are meant to be accepted cleanly. He saw Mr. Hargrove twice. The first time was in the hotel corridor on the 2nd floor, where Edward Hargrove was walking with a cane. A real cane, this time, polished wood, used with the considered care of someone who needs it genuinely. He was speaking to Gerald. He didn't acknowledge Marcus, but he glanced at him. It was a brief glance, sideways, the kind that contains more information than a longer look, because it was clearly meant to be brief, to not be noticed. Marcus noticed it. The second time was more significant. It was a Thursday afternoon in late May. Marcus was delivering a small crate of bar glassware from the supply room to the bar, an errand Carl had sent him on, a test of his ability to carry things carefully, which Marcus suspected was less about the glasses and more about the principle. He turned down the corridor that ran past the executive suites and saw, at the far end, a door that was slightly open. The door to what he'd learned was Mr. Hargrove's private office on that floor. Through the gap, he could see a safe. Not the whole safe, just the door of it. Dark metal, built into the wall behind a panel that had been swung open. Mr. Hargrove was at the safe. His back was to the corridor. His hands were on the handle. Then something, perhaps the sound of Marcus's sneakers on the corridor floor, the faint squeak that Marcus had been meaning to address, made Mr. Hargrove turn. They looked at each other. Edward Hargrove, in that moment, did something that Marcus had not expected. He did not look startled or embarrassed or caught. He looked at Marcus with the steady, measuring attention of a man who is used to looking at things on his own terms. And then he reached out and closed the safe door. And then he reached out further and closed the panel over it. And then he closed the office door. Quietly. Deliberately, without explanation. Marcus stood in the corridor for a moment, holding his crate of glasses. He thought about the cane. He thought about the dark glasses and the drugstore cane, and the $5, and Gerald saying, "That is a question I'd encourage you to hold on to." He thought about the safe. He continued to the bar. He did not mention it to anyone. In June, Preston Hargrove came back to Charleston. He arrived, as he tended to, with the energy of a man who has already decided the outcome of the visit and is attending it as a courtesy. Marcus had not met him, would not meet him formally for months, but he heard about him from the staff, the way staff members always hear about the owner's family. In fragments, in the break room, in the gaps between tasks, when people say what they actually think. "He was in there with Mr. H for 3 hours, said Darnell, one of the banquet servers, eating his lunch with the economical speed of someone working a double shift. Came out looking like he'd gotten exactly what he wanted, which means he didn't get anything. "What's he want?" Marcus asked. Darnell shrugged. "What they always want, the thing their parents built, just faster." Marcus thought about this for a while. He thought about Carl polishing the glasses no one was watching. He thought about what it means to want something your whole life that was built by someone else's hands. In late June, 3 days before the 4th of July weekend, Diana Webb was called into a meeting with the hotel's operations manager, a man named Briggs, who reported to the general manager, but whose demeanor suggested he reported primarily to himself. The meeting was brief. Briggs explained that the hotel was restructuring third-floor housekeeping operations and that Diana's position was being reclassified. Her hours would be reduced to part-time, effective the 1st of August. Diana thanked him and walked back to her station. She told Marcus that evening at the kitchen table, in the measured, factual way she told him most things, presenting the information and then waiting to see how he arranged it. Marcus arranged it carefully. He did not say anything for a while. "Is it because of me?" he asked. "Coming to the hotel?" "No," Diana said. She was precise about this, in a way that Marcus believed because she was always precise. "It's not about you." He believed her. He also understood, at 11, with the comprehension that children develop when the world has not been careful with them, that the timing of a thing and the reason for a thing are not always the same. Edward Hargrove heard about Diana's reclassification the following morning. He was at the writing desk, adding to the letter. Gerald delivered the information in the same tone he delivered everything. Complete, sequential, without editorializing. Edward listened, set down his pen. "Reverse it," he said. "Sir, Mr. Briggs has the operational authority to—" "Reverse it, Gerald." Gerald made a note and sent Briggs a copy of the standard process for reclassification decisions of this type, the one that requires the VP of Human Resources sign-off. "Yes, sir. Has Preston spoken to Briggs recently?" A pause. The pause told Edward what he needed to know. "I see," Edward said. He picked up his pen. He added 2 sentences to the letter. Then he opened the letter and read it from the beginning, which he hadn't done in a while. It was getting long. It was the longest letter he'd ever written in his life. Longer than any contract, longer than any speech, longer than the statement he'd given to the board of directors in 2003, when he'd announced the bankruptcy and watched 20 people's expressions shift from loyalty to calculation. He read to the end of what he'd written and then set it down. He looked at the safe. He'd had the safe installed 11 years ago, after Margaret's death, when he'd moved certain things from the house in Mount Pleasant, things he didn't want to look at every day but couldn't bring himself to dispose of. The safe held these things: a photograph, a ring, some papers and, added 6 months ago, with a deliberateness that he understood was both practical and symbolic, a watch. The watch was a Waltham Elgin pocket watch from 1923, the kind his grandfather had carried. It was not especially valuable by current standards. What made it significant was that it was the one object Edward had kept during the bankruptcy, the one thing, when everything else was being catalogued and sold and distributed, that he had looked at and said, "No, not this one." He'd carried it in his breast pocket for 2 years of rebuilding, like a talisman, or a reminder, or both. He'd stopped wearing it after Margaret died. He hadn't been able to say precisely why. He put it back on briefly for the afternoon of the fake blindness, the afternoon on the bench. He'd worn it that day without being fully conscious of why until afterward, when he was replaying the afternoon in the back of the car and realized he'd wanted something real about himself to be present, even while everything else was performance. The boy had seen it. He'd been holding the kit box when they walked to the bench, and the watch had been in Edward's waistcoat pocket with the chain showing. And Marcus had looked at it with the expression of someone cataloguing things, not covetously, but curiously. Why does a blind man need to know what time it is? He hadn't asked. He'd noticed and then moved on, which is what careful people do. Edward took the watch out of the safe, held it in his palm, the weight of it. The case was warm from his hand already. It warmed quickly, it always had. Not yet, he said to himself. He placed it back in the safe. He went back to the letter and added a final sentence to this section, the one about the watch, and then he set the pen down and looked out the window at the harbour. His heart, that overtaxed and overachieving organ, was doing something irregular against his ribs. Not painful, just present. Reminding him, the way it had been doing with increasing frequency, that it was there and that it was not permanent. Not yet, he said again. This time he wasn't sure what he meant by it. The will and the watch. The summer passed the way Charleston summers do, in a long, saturated haze of heat and humidity, the kind that presses down on the city like a hand, the kind that makes everything move a little slower and feel a little heavier, and occasionally produces, in the early evenings, thunderstorms so sudden and dramatic that tourists photograph them. Edward moved through the summer with the particular deliberateness of a man who has decided he will not be hurried by anything, including his own body. He was at the hotel most mornings by 8. He met with Gerald, reviewed the operational reports, walked the lobby with the attention of someone who has loved a building long enough to notice things that employees stop noticing. A light in the bar entrance that needed replacing. A scratch on the concierge desk that had appeared sometime in July. The particular way the afternoon light came through the east-facing windows in the restaurant and fell across the tables at an angle that needed the window film adjusted. He dictated notes. He made decisions. He signed documents. He was, by any external measure, fully functional. By September, he had stopped pretending otherwise to himself. He scheduled the appointment with his cardiologist for the second week of September and came away with what he had known he would come away with. A confirmation, delivered with clinical precision, of a timeline that was measured not in decades, but in seasons. Possibly more, possibly less. The heart does not negotiate, the cardiologist said, with the regret of a man who has learned this truth repeatedly by delivering it to other people. Edward thanked him, tipped the parking attendant, drove home. He called his attorney, a woman named Catherine Moss, who had handled his legal affairs for 15 years and who was, in Edward's assessment, one of the 3 most honest people he'd encountered in professional life, the other 2 being his late wife and a contractor in Savannah who had once voluntarily disclosed a structural problem he could have concealed. "I need to revise the document," he said. "All of it or specific sections?" "Substantially all of it." A silence on the line. Catherine Moss was not a person who filled silences unnecessarily. "When would you like to meet?" "This week," Edward said. "And Catherine, there will be a supplementary document, a separate envelope. I want it attached to the primary document, but sealed and labelled to be opened by the designated recipient upon their 18th birthday, not before." Another silence, slightly different in quality. "All right," she said. "I'll need the complete content of both." "I'll have it ready," he told no one. Preston called twice in September, both times with the energy of a man who is trying to take the temperature of a situation without appearing to take the temperature of a situation. Edward answered his questions with the courteous vagueness he had perfected over 2 decades. Yes, he was feeling well enough. No, there were no new developments with the board. Yes, they should have dinner when Preston was next in Charleston. Of course.
He was in the process of becoming, in ways Preston couldn't see, the most transparent he had ever been.
Marcus turned 12 in October. He came to the hotel on his birthday, a Saturday, which was not normally one of his hotel days, but Carl Whitmore had asked him to come in for a special preparation session for the fall menu changeover. Marcus arrived at 10 in the morning and found the bar already set up with a row of ingredients and a small cake on the far end of the counter, decorated with the words, "Happy Birthday, Marcus," in blue frosting, and Carl standing behind the bar with the expression of a man who is not comfortable with displays of affection, but has made an exception. "Don't read too much into the cake," Carl said. "It's from the pastry kitchen. They were going to throw out the sample." "Right," Marcus said. "Diana mentioned it was your birthday. That's all." "Okay," Marcus said. Carl began the session, which was thorough and detailed and involved a great deal of information about seasonal citrus. Marcus ate 2 pieces of cake and learned more about grapefruit than he'd known was possible to know, and left in the early afternoon with $30 and the particular feeling of a day that has been good in a quiet and unremarkable way, which is the best kind. He was on the sidewalk outside, crossing toward his milk crate. Saturday afternoons were still productive. He'd learned to maximize the weekends. When he heard his name, he stopped, turned. Edward Hargrove was standing at the entrance of the hotel. Not with a cane, not with dark glasses, just standing, one hand resting on the brass doorframe, in a suit that Marcus recognized as expensive, the way you recognize quality in a thing you don't own, but have been around long enough to understand. "Happy birthday, Marcus," Edward said. Marcus looked at him. He was aware, suddenly and acutely, of a number of things simultaneously. The October light, which was the same gold as it had been a year ago. The milk crate across the street. The fact that he had never heard Mr. Hargrove say his name before. And the sensation of something that had been a question for almost a year beginning, slowly, to resolve into something like an answer. "Thank you, sir," Marcus said. Edward nodded. He looked at Marcus for a moment with the calm, deliberate attention that Marcus had come to recognize as his default mode of engaging with the world. "Carl tells me you have good instincts for how things work," Edward said. "Carl is generous," Marcus said. Something shifted in Edward's expression. Not quite a smile, but the precursor of one. "Carl Whitmore," he said, "has not been generous about a person's ability in 30 years of working for me. I'd take the compliment at face value." He held Marcus's gaze for one more moment, then he said, "Good afternoon," and went back inside. Marcus stood on the sidewalk. He looked at the door where Edward Hargrove had been. Then he looked at his milk crate. Then he thought, the watch. The pocket watch on the chain. He'd seen it again today, briefly, through the hotel entrance as Edward had turned. The same watch. The one from the bench. Why does a man who can't see need to know what time it is? And then, standing there in the October light, with the question he'd been holding for a year, a second question arrived alongside it. Why does a man who is pretending he can't see wear a watch he doesn't need? Because he wanted something real about himself to be there. Even in the performance. Even in the test. Marcus filed this away. He crossed the street. He sat on his milk crate. He was 12 years old, and he understood more than he was supposed to. Edward Hargrove died on a Tuesday in July, 17 months later. It was not sudden in the sense that nothing had been sudden for the past 8 months. His body had been making a series of increasingly insistent announcements that were not being ignored so much as managed, attended to with medication and adjustment, and the careful economy of a man husbanding his remaining energy for things that mattered. He'd been in the hospital for 11 days. Gerald had been there each morning. Catherine Moss had visited twice with documents. Preston had arrived on day 3 and had not left, which Edward had noted and which had produced in him a complex set of feelings he chose not to examine too closely in the time he had left. He'd finished the letter in April. He'd sealed the envelope himself and placed it in the safe. He had not told Preston the safe's combination. He had given it to Catherine Moss in a sealed letter with instructions. The will reading was held in a conference room at Catherine Moss's firm on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after the funeral. Preston arrived with his own lawyer, a man from Atlanta named Harrell, who had the particular energy of someone who has been hired to be skeptical of everything in the room. Catherine Moss received him with the specific warmth of someone who is also going to defeat him in approximately 30 minutes. Gerald was there. Diana Webb had been asked to attend and had arrived in her best clothes with her hands folded in her lap and an expression of careful, quiet dignity. Marcus, who was now 13, sat beside his mother. He was wearing a tie, his only tie, a navy one Diana had bought at a thrift store and pressed twice. And he'd spent the car ride over telling himself to pay attention to everything. The existing will, the one that left the estate to Preston with charitable bequests, was not the will on the table. The will on the table was 17 pages, dated the previous October, and had been witnessed by 3 independent parties, including Catherine Moss and 2 attorneys from her firm. It established, in the careful language of a document that has been built to withstand assault, a charitable trust, the Hargrove Foundation, to receive the bulk of the liquid assets, approximately $62 million, for distribution to organizations focused on economic mobility and youth workforce development in the southeastern United States. A management trust for Hargrove Palace Hotel, to be administered by an independent board for a period of not less than 20 years, with profits split between the foundation and operating costs, and the property itself to remain in perpetuity under the Hargrove name. A residential property in Mount Pleasant, the house where Edward had lived until Margaret's death, to be held in trust for the benefit of Diana Webb and her children for their lifetimes, and a scholarship fund, bearing the name of no one, established at Hargrove Palace in the amount of $100,000, specifically designated for post-secondary education, administered by the foundation, with the first and permanent scholarship awarded to Marcus Leon Webb, son of Diana Webb, employee of Hargrove Palace. The sealed envelope, to be opened by Marcus Leon Webb upon his attainment of the age of 18, was recorded as an attachment, its contents not disclosed, its physical location in the hotel safe noted. Catherine Moss finished reading. The room was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of a space where multiple people are doing rapid internal arithmetic. Preston's lawyer, Harrell, was the first to speak. We'll need time to review the document's provenance, specifically the timeline of revision and the question of undue influence by... There is no question of undue influence, Catherine Moss said. Her tone was courteous and absolute. Mr. Hargrove revised his estate plan over a period of 14 months in consultation with this office, with full cognitive capacity, as attested by his neurologist and cardiologist, and corroborated by independent psychological evaluation conducted in February of this year. The documentation is complete. He had a relationship with a minor child who is named as a beneficiary. He had a documented philanthropic interest in youth development that predates any contact with the Webb family by a decade, Catherine Moss said. I have the records. Mr. Harrell, Preston said in a voice that was very controlled. Perhaps a moment. I don't need a moment, Harrell said. This will is going to be challenged on the grounds. My father had the right, Preston said, and something in his voice, not quite grief, but something adjacent to it, something that grief is sometimes the mask for, made Harrell stop. He had the right, Preston said again. He was looking at the table. He always did whatever he decided was right. That was never the problem. He stood up. He looked at Marcus for a moment, the first time he'd looked directly at him during the entire reading. Do you even know why he did this? Preston asked. His voice was controlled, but the control was expensive. You could see what it was costing him. Marcus looked back at him. Across the table, Diana Webb put her hand on Marcus's arm, very lightly. I think, Marcus said carefully, I know what he was trying to say. I don't think the money is what he was trying to say. Preston stared at him. He wanted to prove something, Marcus said. I think he wanted to prove it to himself more than anyone else. The room was very quiet. Then Preston turned to Harold and said, "We're leaving." "Mr. Hargrove, if we don't—" "We're leaving," Preston said. "I need to think." He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. The same door frame posture his father had used, which Marcus noticed and which was the most quietly devastating thing in the room. Then he left. Harold closed his briefcase. "This isn't over," he said, to the room in general. "It rarely is," Catherine Moss said pleasantly. "Good morning, Mr. Harold." After they left, the room held a different kind of quiet. Gerald was looking at his hands. Diana Webb was very still. Marcus was thinking about the watch. He was thinking about the safe. He was thinking about a bench outside a hotel in October light, and a $5 bill, and a man with dark glasses who had looked at him with eyes that weren't closed at all. Harold had called his Atlanta office before the elevator reached the lobby. The challenge would be filed within the week. The question of what would happen next was entirely open. What $5 buys? The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in November in the probate court of Charleston County, in a wood-paneled room that smelled of old documents and central heating, and the particular institutional seriousness of a space where people have been making formal arguments for a long time. Marcus sat in the third row with his mother and Catherine Moss's associate, a young woman named Torres, who had spent the previous 2 weeks compiling documentation with the thoroughness of someone who was taking this personally. Preston sat at the petitioner's table with Harold and a second attorney Marcus didn't recognize. He was wearing a charcoal suit and looked like he hadn't been sleeping well. Marcus, sitting in the gallery, had the feeling of watching something happen at the end of a long rope, a motion that had been set in force months ago and was only now reaching its full extension. The argument Harold was making was undue influence. Specifically, that Edward Hargrove's relationship with a minor child and his mother, an employee, had constituted an inappropriate dependency that had compromised his testamentary capacity. The word manipulation was used. The phrase exploitation of a vulnerable elderly person appeared twice in the written brief, which Torres had given Marcus a copy of, with a look that suggested Torres had opinions about Harold as a human being. The counter-documentation was, as Catherine Moss had promised, complete. Neurological evaluation, psychiatric clearance, 14 months of documented will revisions, each with witness signatures, a letter from Edward's cardiologist attesting to his full cognitive functioning throughout the revision period, records of the Hargrove Foundation's prior philanthropic commitments to youth development, predating Diana Webb's employment. Gerald's deposition, 9 pages, delivered with the measured precision of a man who has worked for the same employer for 22 years and has specific opinions about what that employer was and wasn't capable of being manipulated into. It was Gerald's testimony that was being discussed when the hearing shifted. Harold was making the point that Gerald, as a long-time loyalist, was not an objective witness. The judge, a woman named Calloway, who had the expression of someone who has heard approximately everything and has developed a filtering system accordingly, was asking clarifying questions about the timeline of events. And then Harold made a mistake. He was attempting to establish that Marcus's presence at the hotel had been the decisive factor in Edward's change of heart, which was, in Harold's framing, evidence of manipulation. "The fact remains," Harold said, "that this boy was placed in proximity to the testator in circumstances that his own mother, as an employee, was positioned to arrange." "I wasn't placed there," Marcus said. He hadn't meant to speak. The words came out at regular volume, which in the hearing room felt like a great deal of volume. Judge Calloway looked at him. Torres touched his arm. "I'm sorry," Marcus said to the judge. "I know I'm not supposed to." "You're a party to this proceeding," Judge Calloway said. She had very clear eyes, the kind that make you feel as though being imprecise in front of them would be a waste of everyone's time. "Through your guardian, you can speak to your representative, who can relay your statement." Torres leaned over and Marcus said quietly what he wanted to say. Torres listened. Then she stood and said, "Your Honor, The respondent would like to note for the record that Marcus Webb was not introduced to Mr. Hargrove's attention through his mother's employment. He would like to note that he met Mr. Hargrove on a public sidewalk in a circumstance that was of Mr. Hargrove's own arrangement. He did not know who the man was. He helped him because the man appeared to need help. That's a self-serving statement, Harold said. It's corroborated by the hotel's own exterior security footage, Torres said pleasantly, which we have subpoenaed and provided to the court, and which shows the encounter precisely as described. We also note that the footage shows the boy waiting with Mr. Hargrove for approximately 11 minutes, returning to his own station on the opposite sidewalk and having no further contact with him for 6 weeks, at which point Mr. Hargrove arranged an introduction through his own staff. A beat. Mr. Hargrove chose to know this boy, Torres said, based on his own observation, over a period of months, for reasons he documented extensively in his own hand and which are part of the record. Harold regrouped. He moved to his next argument, the question of the sealed envelope. He wanted it opened now, in the proceedings, on the grounds that its contents might be relevant to the question of undue influence. The envelope is sealed by the testator's explicit instruction, Catherine Moss said, from her seat at the respondent's table, with the calm of someone stating a physical law. It is addressed to Marcus Webb and is to be opened on his 18th birthday. That instruction is legally binding. It will not be opened today. If it contains instructions that further the manipulation, Mr. Harrell, Judge Calloway said, in a tone that ended sentences, the contents of a sealed document cannot be considered in a proceeding where they are unknown. If you have specific grounds to believe the document contains material relevant to your claim of undue influence, you'll need to provide that grounds. Might contain does not constitute grounds in this court. She made a note. We'll take a recess. In the recess, Marcus sat in the hallway with his mother. Diana Webb put her arm around him. "You okay?" she said. He thought about it. Mr. Harrell called it manipulation, he said. I know. Like I did something like I planned it. He was working through the feeling carefully, the way he worked through most things. I just helped an old man to a bench. I know, Diana said again. And I gave him $5. He almost laughed. My $5. Diana looked at him. Her expression was the one he knew best, the one that contained the most, that held all the things she chose to say and all the things she chose not to say, and balanced them. He knew that, she said. Whatever else was in that envelope, he knew that. Marcus leaned against the wall. Across the hall, through the tall windows, the November light fell flat and grey over the city. It was nothing like October light. It was the light of a city getting ready for something colder, getting its collar up against what was coming. He thought about the watch. He always came back to the watch. Not yet, the old man had said to himself in his office. Marcus had only heard it because the corridor had been quiet. Not yet. As if the watch had somewhere to go. As if it was waiting. Preston appeared at the end of the hallway. He walked toward them. He stopped at a distance that was too close for strangers and too far for anything else. I'm not going to keep fighting this, he said. He wasn't looking at Diana. He was looking at Marcus. I want you to know that. Harold's going to file a brief this week, and I'm going to tell him to withdraw it. Marcus waited. I don't think you're a bad kid, Preston said. His voice had the careful quality of a man who has rehearsed something and is discovering that the rehearsed version doesn't quite fit the actual room. I don't think your mother is a bad person. He stopped. I think my father was... Another stop, a longer one this time, as if the sentence had a door in the middle of it, and what was behind the door was not something he was ready to show. He was always more interested in finding out what people were made of than in telling them what they meant to him. He looked away. I learned that late. He turned and walked back down the hallway. Marcus watched him go. He thought about the last thing Preston had said and the way he'd said it, and the specific quality of pain that had been present in the saying. Not performed pain, but the real kind the kind that a person carries for years before they find a moment that accidentally lets some of it out. He thought, "I'm sorry for you. I didn't do anything to make this happen, but I'm sorry for you anyway." He didn't say it. Some things are true without needing to be said. That was another thing he'd learned on the milk crate, in the long afternoons of watching the street. Harold withdrew the brief on a Wednesday. Marcus found out through Torres, who sent his mother a text message, that Diana read at the kitchen table on Thursday morning and then turned the phone over without saying anything, which was how Marcus knew the news was good. She only turned the phone over for news that she needed a moment with. He should have felt relieved. He did for about a week. And then something else set in, something slower, harder to name, more like weather than feeling. It started with a look. He was back at school, back at the milk crate on the days that weren't hotel days, back in the ordinary texture of his life. And people knew that was the thing he hadn't fully accounted for. The story had been in the local news. Not big news, not front-page news, but the Charleston paper had run a piece about the estate dispute in its community section. And the dispute included his name, and people who didn't read the paper had heard from people who did. And the result was that Marcus Webb's life had been annotated. At school, there were looks, some curious, some warm, some of the particular kind that 13-year-olds produce when someone they know has stumbled into an adult situation that feels unfair to them in the way that adult situations often do. Unfair in a way that suggests the world operates by rules that haven't been explained to them yet, and resent it. But some of the looks were different, cooler. Must be nice. He heard this once in the cafeteria from a boy named Deshaun, who had never been unkind to him before. Said under the breath, just loud enough. The kind of comment that exists to be heard but not responded to, that functions as a test of its own. Marcus ate his lunch. He sat with the comment the way he sat with most things, not suppressing it, not reacting to it, just holding it and looking at it until it became something he understood. Must be nice. What was nice? A dead man's watch in a sealed envelope in a hotel safe. A scholarship to a college he hadn't applied to yet, for a future he couldn't fully picture. A house his mother could live in that didn't belong to either of them in any way they'd built themselves. An inheritance from someone who had chosen them not because of blood, but because of character. And what do you do with the weight of being chosen for your character? How do you carry that without it changing you into something that is carrying a weight instead of just living? He didn't know. He went to the milk crate on the following Saturday. He hadn't been for 2 weeks. The proceedings, the news coverage, his mother's worry, all of it had kept him elsewhere, kept him inside the tangle of the situation. He sat on the milk crate on the corner of Meeting and Hassel and set up his kit box and looked at the entrance of Hargrove Palace. There was a new doorman. Not Marcus Tully. Tully had retired in August. This one was younger, built straight, with a courteous nod for everyone who passed. The bench was still there, the magnolia tree. The October light was gone. It was December now, cold in the way Charleston gets cold, damp and specific, the cold that lives in the historic buildings and comes out through the brick. Nobody came for a shine for almost an hour. Marcus sat. He thought about the scholarship, about what it would mean to decline it. To walk back into Catherine Moss's office and say, "I don't want it." He had played out this scenario several times in the past 3 weeks. In some versions, it felt like integrity. In some versions, it felt like stupidity. In some versions, it felt like the most honest thing he could do. I helped you because you needed help, not because I wanted something from you. I don't want this to be a transaction. I don't want to have traded a $5 bill for a future. Was that right? Or was that just pride? The same monstrous kind that destroys things, wearing the costume of integrity? He didn't know. The December light was thin and pale and provided no answers. A man came for a shine, middle-aged, pleasant, clearly a tourist, wearing shoes that needed more work than he was going to pay for. Marcus worked on them anyway, the full conditioning, the careful attention to the heel edges. Carl Whitmore's voice in his head, Every glass. Not the ones people will see. All of them. The man tipped $3. Marcus said thank you and meant it. He sat. He thought about Edward Hargrove on this bench in the October light, holding a $5 bill with hands that were shaking. He thought about, in case nobody else stops. He hadn't said that because he'd wanted something. He'd said it because it was true, because an old man, alone on a bench in a city full of people in a hurry, might need $5 and might need someone to say, "I see that you're here." And both of those things were simple and available, and so he'd done them. That was all it had been. The question was whether it still could be, now that the story had grown up around it. He sat for a while longer. Then he made a decision. Not a dramatic one, not an announced one, just the kind that happens when you've thought about something long enough that the thinking is finished and what's left is the answer. He would keep the scholarship, not because it was his or because he'd earned it in any conventional sense. Because to refuse it would be to say that what he'd done on that bench had been conditional, that his kindness had a price, and the price was too high, and so he was returning it. And it hadn't been conditional, it had been free. And the scholarship was Edward Hargrove's response to a free thing, also free, also unconditional, offered back across the gap between who they were. To refuse that would be to unmake the exchange. He would keep it. He would earn it, not in the sense that justified the having of it, but in the sense that you carry the things people give you by becoming someone worthy of the giving. He would go to college. He would learn things. He would make something of the life that had been believed in, not because he owed it to anyone, but because that was the proper way to receive a gift. He packed up his kit box. He crossed the street and went into the hotel. He found Carl Whitmore in the bar doing inventory. "You're okay?" Carl said without looking up. "Yeah," Marcus said. "I think so." Carl made a note in his inventory book. "Good," he said. "The grapefruit delivery came in yesterday. There's something off about the sourcing. I want you to taste the difference between these two and tell me what you think." He produced 2 slices of grapefruit. Marcus tasted them. This was, he understood, exactly the right thing to be doing. 5 years pass quickly when you are learning things. Marcus Webb turned 18 on a Thursday in October, and Catherine Moss's office called to arrange the opening of the envelope at his convenience, which turned out to be the following Saturday, because the week of his birthday was occupied by the beginning of his freshman year at the College of Charleston, where he had enrolled on the Hargrove Scholarship in the business school, with a secondary focus in hospitality management. A combination that Carl Whitmore had called obvious in the best possible way, and that Marcus had found he couldn't argue with. His mother drove him to Catherine Moss's office on a Saturday morning. Gerald came, Torres came, Carl Whitmore came, because no one had told him not to, and he had decided on his own that he should be there, which was the kind of decision Carl made. The envelope was the same one Edward had sealed. You could tell it had been handled occasionally. The edges were slightly soft, but it was intact. Catherine Moss handed it to Marcus. He held it for a moment. Then he opened it. Inside, the letter, handwritten on hotel stationery, 12 pages, and the watch in a small velvet pouch on a chain. He took out the watch first. He held it in his palm. It was heavier than he'd expected. Heavier than something that size had a right to be, the way old things sometimes are, as if they've absorbed the weight of the years they've survived. He looked at it for a long time. Then he unfolded the letter. He read it in the chair by Catherine Moss's window, while everyone else in the room had the good grace to look elsewhere. His mother was looking at her hands. Gerald was looking at the view. Carl Whitmore was looking at a shelf of legal volumes as though he was genuinely interested in them. The letter was long. It was, as Edward had apparently intended, not a document so much as a conversation, the kind that couldn't happen while one person is alive and the other is 11. It began with the afternoon on the bench, which Edward described with a precision that told Marcus he'd thought about it many times, not once. It moved through the months of watching the cameras, which the letter addressed directly, with a frankness that Marcus appreciated.
I know this is an odd thing to admit. I watched you for a long time before I spoke to you. I'm not sure this was the right thing to do, but I was out of practice at trusting people, and you were the evidence I needed that trust was still worth practicing. It moved through Margaret, through Preston, through the bankruptcy and the rebuilding, and the lesson that the bankruptcy had incorrectly taught him. I learned the wrong thing from hard times. I learned that people leave when you have nothing. What I should have learned is that some people leave and others stay, and the question of which kind you're dealing with is answerable if you pay attention. It moved through Carl, through Gerald, through Diana.
Your mother is one of the most dignified people I have ever had working for me. That she raised someone like you is not a surprise. That she did it alone, in this city, with the grace she did it with. That is extraordinary, and I want you to know that I saw it. And then, 12 pages in, with the economy of someone who has learned how to spend words after spending too many of them, it ended, I gave you a scholarship. You gave me back my faith in people. I think you got the worse end of that deal. The watch belonged to my grandfather, and then my father, and then me. I have no one to give it to who would understand what it means. It means time is the thing you can't buy back, so pay attention to it. It means the things you keep when everything else is gone tell you who you actually are. It means I was here. I tried to be careful with the time I had. I hope you will be too. Edward Hargrove. P.S. You asked Gerald why I did this. He told me. The answer to your question is, I did this because you walked across a street when you didn't have to. Everything else followed from that. Marcus lowered the letter. He looked at the watch in his palm. His mother was looking at him now from across the room with the expression he knew best, the one that held everything and said quietly, I'm here. I see you. He got up. He walked to her. He sat down beside her. She put her arm around him the same way she had in the courthouse hallway. The same gesture, the same warmth, the particular warmth of being known by someone who knew you before you knew yourself. He showed her the watch. She looked at it. What does it say? She asked. There was an engraving on the case, small, in a style that required a certain angle of light to read. Marcus tipped it toward the window. In trust, it said, and in time. He fastened the chain to his waistcoat button. He was wearing a button-down with a waistcoat, the outfit his mother had said was appropriate for the occasion, and slipped the watch into the pocket. He could feel the weight of it against his ribs. Later, in the afternoon, he walked by himself to the corner of Meeting Street and Hazel. The milk crate was gone. He'd given it up 3 years ago when the homework load in high school had made the afternoon sessions impossible. The hotel was still there, of course. Hargrove Palace, the brass plate on the entrance door as polished as it had always been. The lobby murmuring behind the glass the way it always had. The bench was still there, the magnolia, the October light. He stood at the corner for a while, with his hands in his pockets and the watch against his ribs. He thought about a man who had put on dark glasses and a drugstore cane and stood outside his own hotel and waited to see who would stop. He thought about crossing the street. He thought about how small the gesture had been, how utterly unremarkable, really, in the inventory of things a person could do with an afternoon. You see someone who seems to need help. You help them. You give what you have, which is your time and your presence and, if it comes to that, your last $5. And then you go back to your milk crate and you polish the next pair of shoes. That's all it had been. He reached into his waistcoat pocket and took out the watch. Checked the time. It kept good time, he'd discovered, better than expected for something 100 years old. The secret of that, Carl would have said, is attention and maintenance. The secret of most things is attention and maintenance. He put the watch back. He looked at the hotel entrance one more time. Then he adjusted his collar against the October cold and walked on. The watch goes wherever he goes now. It has been to lecture halls, to job interviews, to a semester abroad in Lyon,
where he studied hotel operations in a city that takes hospitality as seriously as Edward Hargrove ever did. It has been to his mother's kitchen table, where he sometimes takes it out and sets it beside his coffee cup while he reads. It has been, twice, to the bench outside Hargrove Palace on October afternoons when the light is that particular gold and the magnolia tree is doing what magnolia trees do, and the city moves around him at its Charleston pace, unhurried, layered, carrying its history the way the people who've lived in it long enough carry theirs. He never goes there to feel anything in particular. He doesn't believe in performing grief or gratitude or any feeling that has an appropriate stage. He goes because it's a place he knows, and because knowing a place, the way you know the weight of it, the smell of it in different seasons, the specific quality of its light, is a kind of faith. He is, at 18, at 19, becoming the person he is going to be, not because of the money, not because of the scholarship, the house, the letter, the watch, because of what he already was before any of that existed. Edward Hargrove didn't make him, he just noticed him. And sometimes that's the thing, being seen, precisely, by someone with clear enough eyes at the right moment is what turns possibility into direction. The watch says, in trust and in time. He has both. If this story moved you, thank you for spending time with it. These stories are made to be shared. If you know someone who needs to hear that the small things matter, share it with them. And we'll see you in the next one.